Hello, this is Linkonair, and today we'll be reviewing Far Cry 3, a game I've never played before, nor have I had much outside exposure to outside of the research I put in for the review. My only experience with the Far Cry series so far has been Far Cry 2, a game I didn't really find all that engaging. That being said, let's get started. You play as a floating pair of arms named Jason Brody, who along with his friends ends up getting kidnapped by pirates while out skydiving. At this point you were introduced to Vass, the psychopath who does the "Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity?" bit in that one E3 demo, who is the leader of the pirates who kidnapped you and your friends. Shortly after, you and your older brother attempt to escape and fail as Voss kills your brother right before your eyes, and lets you try to escape as some sort of sick game. After your questionably successful escape, you are introduced to Dennis, who tries to help you become a warrior so you can rescue your friends and escape the island. After you are finished with this introduction, you go through about 4 story arcs, each of which results in a friend or two being rescued in the process. And these arcs, much like the rest of the game, I can only describe by example. First arc is sort of like Tomb Raider's reboot, where Jason comes to terms with having to kill as a means to an end that seems impossible to achieve, that end being rescuing his friends and escaping this island. The second arc is a bit like Indiana Jones, where Jason has gotten a grip of himself and is starting to enjoy all the killing he's doing, and the arc ends with him saving himself and his girlfriend from a collapsing temple, followed by a chase sequence where you fight off pirates while driving through the jungle. Arc 3 is like National Treasure, where you team up with Sean Bean to track down an ancient artifact and totally don't get backstabbed. Arc 4 is like James Bond, because you get a wingsuit and you disguise yourself to get close with the villain. I actually haven't seen James Bond, so I could be way off the mark. Characterization in this game is pretty poor. You might have noticed how I haven't mentioned too many characters by name, and that's just because most of them didn't really stick out to me, with the exception of Jason, Voss, and Hoyt. The best thing I can say about the story is Jason's change from being a civilized person to a savage killer. Voss and Hoyt are only notable as being psychopaths, and a less interesting psychopath who seems to come out of nowhere. Overall, the story was pretty weak, however the characters were well voiced, and the story missions were at least compelling enough to make me wonder what was coming next. The gameplay is pretty straightforward. It's an open-world first-person shooter with RPG elements. Now let me just say, first impressions were bad. The game starts with a terrible linear stealth segment. Game devs, the first 10 minutes of gameplay should give the player a good idea of what the game is about. A good setup for a story is all well and good, but as I stated, the story for the game is pretty weak, and it's not even the focus of the game. In this regard, I'd say Far Cry 2 is stronger, since it pretty much forced you into combat straight away, so you'd know what type of action would be awaiting you. I feel kind of bad saying this too, since the game is made by Ubisoft Montreal, the same devs who make Assassin's Creed, and their execution with that series has been great so far. Intro mission aside, once the game opens up and introduces its mechanics, it becomes pretty darn engaging. Across the island, you can hunt the wildlife to upgrade your item and ammo carrying equipment. You can overthrow enemy strongholds to unlock safe houses and item shops, both of which contribute to the skill points you gain, which you can put towards, well, skills. These skills can upgrade your health, increase endurance, and gain new killing techniques, each of which are displayed as tattoos on your character's left arm. You can also craft syringes that can heal you, help with hunting, or combat, but the only ones I really found useful were the sprint burst syringes, mostly because it sped up the exploration. There were side missions as well, but I never really saw much reason to do them, because as far as I could tell, they didn't contribute to the story. I can't imagine Jason wanting to stop and do side missions or minigames when his friends are in danger. One of the little touches I really enjoyed was how well you were rewarded for exploring the island. Say you climb a mountain on a route next to your mission. At the top of it you'll usually find treasure and a hang glider. I personally got a lot of enjoyment from using the hang gliders. Kind of reminded me of the time I'd spend in Just Cause 2 surfing on jet planes. I used them all the time up until I got the wingsuit and parachute, which pretty much lets you glide from any high-up location. My biggest issue with the game was the use of button prompts and Quicktime Events. I'm not a big fan of Quicktime Events that can replace things you can do in gameplay, like the anticlimactic knife fights you have against the villains. Perhaps they intended to implement hand-to-hand combat more into the game and just ran out of time or had to cut it. Hard to say. As for the button prompt issues, there are various occasions when you'll have to climb up a cell tower to unlock part of your map, and while climbing there are certain ledges that require you to look at oddly specific parts of the ledge to make a button prompt appear that will allow you to climb up it. It's so clunky and out of place. Having played many other games that run on the Cry engine and let you climb ledges without having to do this, it's completely inexcusable. It's not enough to ruin the game by any means, but it's very distracting. To a lesser extent, I also took issue with the gameplay as a whole. I had difficulty figuring out what was bothering me for the longest time, but after thinking it over, the gameplay reminds me of a lot of things. It's a bit like Assassin's Creed, a bit like Just Cause 2, a bit like Tomb Raider, a bit like Crysis, that one makes at least some sense, and felt like it had very little to make itself feel like its own game. However, it is pretty comical when you see an enemy stronghold being viciously savaged by a flightless bird. If you've played a Crytek game before, you should already know what the visuals are like. If you're unfamiliar with Crytek games, it looks good. Really, really damn good. Large amounts of foliage in the environment, the way the light interacts with the grass at certain times of the day, the high-quality textures, the beautiful fire effects, the fluid animation, whether it be cutscenes or in-game. It's particularly impressive for an open-world title. Sadly, my computer couldn't run it on its highest settings, which is strange since I can run Crysis 1 on Ultra with no slowdown. My only issue was the textures for the slopes on the mountains. They look horrible in comparison. This could just be an issue because I couldn't run it on high, but since it will be a typical experience for the console gamers, I think it can be quite jarring in comparison to the otherwise brilliant visuals. There really isn't a lot more to say on the visuals, so let's move on to the soundtrack.
Musical Monocle here. From tourist to cold-blooded killer, Far Cry 3 is a game that follows a man on his descent into madness. Many a gamer may have noted that this soundtrack utilizes dubstep, but dismay not. The idea is not to follow Jason into a nightclub. The use of dubstep is merely an element of the soundtrack combined with disheveled rhythms and droning synth to create an atmosphere of disorientation. In fact, atmosphere would certainly seem to be the main goal of the soundtrack, as virtually none of the music utilized will be easily recalled by the listener, outside of the effective use of Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries in the helicopter rescue section. All of this to say, it will be recalled as more of a bad trip than a vivid dream. Jason's need to sustain himself on drugs to keep going is yet another contributing factor to the overall jaded atmosphere that this soundtrack elicits. Unfortunately, a side effect of this drone and grit-induced daze is that inspiring and moving moments will be far and few. Occasionally, indigenous Polynesian percussion elements will be present to intensify some of the action, and these are some of the more characteristic moments of the atmosphere. But once again, they are usually just drowned out by the buzz of the soundtrack as a whole. The theme of the soundtrack is rooted in somber piano, deep strings, and choir, accompanied by a few contemporary rock elements, which is fairly moving. However, these bookends of the track are in stark contrast to the style and development of the rest of the soundtrack. So, is this soundtrack effective? Yes, I would say that I can be convinced by the soundtrack of the washed-up daze that our protagonist must be in. However, such lacking elements as danger, emotion, and regional awareness were the cost that was paid for this. If you're looking for something to listen to, I'd suggest the closing track of the soundtrack, or the highly more memorable soundtrack to the standalone expansion, Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon.
Alright, let's wrap this up. The game gets a 6 out of 10. The story is weak and has a pretty good character arc for Jason as he progresses through the game. The gameplay itself is pretty average. It's all stuff you've seen before without a whole lot to make it stand out from the other, better open-world games. If the visuals weren't up to the usual high standard of CryEngine games, this game would have gotten a 5 out of 10. Perfectly average. But there is something to say about games as good-looking as this. I've certainly seen better games before, but in the realm of realistic graphics, it's pretty high up there, along the likes of Crysis and Battlefield 3. I don't know, I haven't actually played Battlefield 3. I recommend this game if you can find it on sale. Otherwise, I'd say skip it. You're better off getting Tomb Raider or Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. If you enjoyed this review, like and subscribe, and feel free to share it with your other gaming buddies. If you have any game recommendations or feedback, leave it in the comments. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got some pirating to do. No, this isn't a segue into my next review. Actually, my next video will be on the next generation of consoles, or new generation of consoles now since they're already out. Mostly me advising that it's not worth your time. I will be working on my next review simultaneously, but expect the next gen video to be up first. Have a good night, you savages!